Okay, Madhu, let's start.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this inaugural edition, if I may call it that, of of Mumbai FinTech Hub's session on how we can help fintechs and startup ecosystem in India sort of look at the larger ASEAN market and understand the nitty-gritties of taking the business to other locations. We have two special guests here this afternoon. I'll start with Pat Patel, who's the executive from Monetary Authority of Singapore. He has a wide experience across the startup ecosystem. He's also sort of championing the whole Epix platform, if I can call it that, which I'll talk about in a minute from now. We also have Varun Mittal. Varun leads the emerging markets, access for EY. He's based in Singapore, and he pretty much is the go-to man for a number of startups if they have to have anything under the sun, from funding to market access to market intelligence. So great to have you both, gentlemen. I'll probably start, with an opening remark from both of you. Pat, if you can just set the context and start with the opening remark.
Sure. So clearly the last 3 months have been challenging for the world. And so some of the things that MAS have been doing is looking at how we can support the fintech community. We've been leveraging APIX to help with some of the sales cycles. We've been working with the private sector to try and inject some capital into the marketplace, and then reaching out to a lot of founders and businesses and seeing where we can support. It's a difficult time for everyone, and it's great that there is a real thriving community. Clearly, Mr. Varun Mittal is key to that in terms of the way that people are going above and beyond by either connecting parties together or just trying to help, whether that's mentoring, whether that's supporting, or even providing insight. And I think the more the community comes together, and groups like this certainly is something that's beneficial for the community. And me personally, I love to support these initiatives. So thank you for having me involved.
Yeah, great. For folks who are on the line, I probably will just spend a minute on what APIX is. APIX is an initiative by a nonprofit called ASEAN Financial Innovation Network. It's also supported by Monetary Authority of Singapore and backed by IFC. So it's well and truly the first open architecture platform that is sort of at the intersection of fintech and innovation. So it's essentially your sort of go-to place if you have to get access to a wide variety of market participants, and it truly is the first of its kind in terms of a open architecture platform. We'll talk about it and take some more questions as we sort of move along. Over to you, Varun, for your opening remark.
Thank you for having me. And as some of you have always been looking at what's the next port of call after India in terms of expansion, eastwards or westwards. So there are opportunities on the west, but on the east you have a 600 million population block, very similar in terms of development to India. And we've been working with looking at how Indian companies can come in. Some of them have already started to do. People will be surprised to know that one of the top 3 banks in Indonesia uses an Indian core banking system, which is not Finacle. It's a small fintech out of Delhi whose core banking is used by one of the top 3 Indonesian banks. There have been stories, and the key part is looking at what can be learned from them, what else can be done to help build that growth story forward, to build those cross-border partnerships, and to build real world-class, globally diversified from revenue as well as footprint companies out of India.
Just to build on that, sorry, Madhu, I think you highlighted the opportunity in Southeast Asia, and there was for anyone on the line, it's worth looking up a report that was produced recently by Google, Temasek, and Bain. So that was produced towards the end of last year, and there's some really good data points in there that help frame what's going on in Southeast Asia, where the opportunity is, and some of the stats around that from my memory. They looked at the the size of the revenue opportunity was around 11 billion last year, and it's due to grow to 38 billion by 2025. Clearly, this was done pre-COVID-19, so some of this might accelerate, some of it may slow down and take a little bit longer than 2025. But when you think about the 600 million kind of population, they worked out a stat around 70% of the population is either underbanked or unbanked. And so when you start to think about the numbers on that scale, there are a number of opportunities which I'd like to elaborate on later in the conversation. And I'm sure Varun has a wealth of insight as well on the details as well as the macro level.
Yeah. In fact, it's interesting you brought that up. In many ways, companies that are operating in India, India is a country of many different countries put together, right? If you look at it, India, Southeast Asia, as it's called, as a new China. But truly within the country, you have, if you just take 4 or 5 states, it adds up to about 500, 600 million people. A lot of the demographic profiles are very similar. Every few hundred kilometers, you have language and cuisine. Lending, I have friends, a lot of friends in the India as a nation. But when you actually take these, when these companies sort of look at expanding, what typically sort of comes to mind? India has done a great job with respect to payments. A lot of work has happened around lending as well, and there's some bit of work that's happening on the logistics sort of space. Right, there's just the fact that it's a very large country and very similar demographic profile, and the state of the economy in many of these emerging markets. Varun, if I can come to you, what are those 3 or 4 key areas that you see lighting up? Which are segments that India has done well from a startup ecosystem standpoint. There's a lot of these companies from China as well that are coming in and looking at opportunities within Southeast Asia. How do you sort of pick winners or segments that are key themes that you see from the ASEAN? You're on mute, Varun.
The key differences in the China, there were 2 big centers of power, and all the fintechs were born around, most of the fintechs were born around them. And India was the opposite spectrum, where the government came in and commoditized the infrastructure, whether it's identity, whether it's payments. So the innovation was on the cutting edge of user experience, real value creation. There was limited innovation you could do on the infra side of the things. So once you take those insights from Southeast Asian context perspective, in Southeast Asia, you can do innovation on infrastructure side as well, because infra in most markets, Singapore is an outlier, is nowhere close to, you won't have that level of digital KYC, you would not have the DigiLockers, you would not have the Aadhaars in most markets. So you can do a lot more on infrastructure. So because you've already seen as an Indian company, you've already seen that, there is a learning curve also, because stuff you take for granted is not for granted in these markets. Right. So a lot of infrastructure innovation. And the second part is, because Indian companies are beyond infrastructure, they're playing at the differentiation layer, they can actually leapfrog the problems or challenges which the companies here are solving. So if you look at the KYC problem, which a company in Indonesia is solving, is still fighting the infrastructure problem. Absolutely. So they have not been able to jump to the next and the next layer, while Indian companies are solving the interactive video KYC, solving cheating in exam problem through that. While Indonesian companies still like 1 layer behind, because not the fault, because Dukcapil is 5 years behind Aadhaar. That's why. Right. So the part is, how do you bring that experience learning to these people, and which is where the scenario is, one, you can enter market. Other scenario is you can come and do a commercial partnership or investment or a 2-way investment equity arrangement with a lot of these companies, where the local guy can give you local partnership, and you can build models around those.
Right. Right.
And Varun, would you say that it's better to partner if you're looking at, say, an Indonesia or even a Philippines or a Vietnamese market, if Indian startups are looking at those regions?
Philippines, you can survive with English alone. Most of the other markets, you cannot survive with English alone. So Indonesia, you should partner. If you're going to go alone with an Indian company headquartered somewhere in India, or even you want to put up like a dummy headquarter in Singapore, it would be very tough. It's language, culture, taxation, controlled currency, 20% withholding tax. For Indonesia, most likely you should have one. Philippines, you can do remotely. Vietnam, you can do remotely because Vietnam, a lot of senior management is, I'll say they have studied abroad. And even the ones in senior management are pretty familiar with English. So there are a lot of Indian companies who are already, Pulitza is doing, MoneyTap is doing stuff in Vietnam. Hyperverge is doing stuff. Unifor is doing stuff in Vietnam. So, but what they did was they partnered with some of the SIs who are international to go to these markets instead of landing directly or finding those contacts. So Vietnam, you can still do. Philippines, very open for Indian companies. Companies like Bank Genie, Vimo are doing direct in Philippines. Thailand or tier 1 clients, you can go direct, but if you're going to do anything below tier 1, you need local partner. Indo, everything. From tier 1 to tier 10, you need a local partner.
Yeah. Shifting gears, Pat, MAS is looked at as, as probably the most forward-looking and forward-thinking sort of, and acting as well from a regulator standpoint. As in the last, sort of 90 odd days, I think if there is one regulator globally who has been proactive in supporting the startup ecosystem and keeping that, making sure that there is enough given to them or support that is there, both financially as well as in terms of other aspects as well. What's driving this, right? I know it's important from your own perspective to sort of make sure that startups are given that room, but why? It's probably a question of why, and thereby it sort of leads us to ask, are we better placed to be a Singapore-based company than any other part of ASEAN, right? So because of the support that you get from the regulator as well.
I mean, I'm very commercial capitalist person. Even outside of the regulator, Singapore has zero capital gains tax. All other countries in Southeast Asia, no other country in Southeast Asia or India will give you zero capital gain tax.
Right.
So what MAS gives you support is awesome, and Pat can talk a lot more about it. I'm just talking capital gains. India is 20% capital gains straight up. Talk about a founder who has to give up 20% of his hard-earned after 6, 8, 10 years of hard work, giving up 20% in taxation. You are a founder yourself.
Right.
And Pat can talk about rest of the non-tax part of coming up in Singapore.
And that 20% can be the difference in the current climate between survival and and falling by the wayside. So it does play a big role. But I think I think necessity is the mother of invention. So if you think Singapore is a small country, it has giants to the left and the right and all around it basically. And so Singapore set on a strategy a number of years ago to kind of become this smart nation and really support its financial services, but its tech ecosystem, and in particular the startups. And so if you think 5 years ago, there were, and Varun will know this, there were maybe less than 100, maybe 60 startups five years ago in the fintech space, and now there's close to 100. And so, I mean, 1,000. Sorry, 1,000, not 100. And so, if you've got the appetite and the will from different levels within government, it makes it easier. Being a small,
and you may want to speak closer to the mic. Sorry.
But being a smaller country and having kind of less levels to go through means that you can create change quite quickly. So if a strategy is set to support the fintech community, it can be mobilized relatively quickly. And so there's less layers to go through. And for Singapore, if you think about it, that it's grown to about 1,000 startups in fintech. That during COVID-19 there was a big fear in March that how do we protect our fintechs? What is the key way to do that? And by having champions across the ecosystem, so whether that's Sopnandu Mahanti at the MAS, or whether that's individuals within Enterprise Singapore Group, whether that is the Singapore FinTech Association, whether that is people like Varun, it's the broader community that have really come together to create some of the change and support in different ways. And we've had a number of initiatives that we've launched in the last few months, but we're well aware that this is just a start. and we have to keep going. So from our perspective and my team, so I run the International FinTech office, and while we have a number of remits, the whole team has been focused on the COVID-19 response. And so we've been working with the FinTech Association here. We've also been working with the private sector to look at how we can launch relief funds, whether that's through grants, whether that's through convertible notes, as well as kind of leveraging other government agencies to support with talent, with operations, and to try and alleviate some of the challenges that the FinTechs are having, and essentially, where possible, to extend some of their runway and support the employees as well. Because if you think the community thrives and you know, the contribution of employment from the FinTech sector is very material. And so these are the things that we've been balancing in the last few months. It feels like, you know, we have at least, you know, 5 to 6 initiatives that we're currently working on. Some take longer to come through than others. And so we see this as a series of measures over a period of time to support at that particular moment. And so, yeah, we're grateful for the support we get and the individuals that are driving the community.
Fantastic.
The second question was around what makes it attractive for businesses. So I think there's a few things here. So if you think about the conducive business environment, and I think Varun's alluded to that, the tax side of things certainly brings a smile to most people's faces. And you know, I heard a stat recently that if you wanted to set up a business in Singapore, you could do that, you know, in under 10 days. And these things make it easier to kind of locate, but also set up your business. And then there's also benefits from kind of certain grants or proof of concepts, initiatives. If your business is focused around AI or data analytics, there are grants that you can tap on if you incorporate here. And clearly, as Varun mentioned, the tax exemptions. But I think, you know, another port of call here is a strong FinTech association, which can help connect organizations. And I think, you know, we did a survey actually yesterday on a series that we run called the Green Shoot series. And we asked our audience, and there were just over 400 people that joined the session. And we asked the audience, you know, which of the following is the biggest impediment to international expansion for startups today? And we gave them 5 options. The first option was finding the right partner, and that was the highest one that come through. That seemed to be, you know, one of the biggest challenges, the biggest impediments, finding the right partner. In second place was regulatory hurdles and incorporation. And so our third was around ability to reach customers. And so, you know, if you start to frame it in that way, and I feel that Singapore is anchored around those. And, you know, we've got the conducive business environment where we support the FinTech community because it's a necessity. You know, we need the FinTech community to thrive because Singapore relies on a handful of strong industries, and FinTech is one of the rising stars. But when we look at kind of sales cycles and partnerships, and that was one of the top impediments. We look at that and we feel that the Apex product that you mentioned, you know, which is an industry sandbox, it's a sandbox in the cloud. And what it does is accelerate proof of concepts between FinTechs and FIs. And because it has the credibility, not just from MAS as one of the founders, we also have IFC, the World Bank's IFC, AMTD Group, and MasterCard as well. So those collection of companies has really strengthened the platform. And so it enables businesses that say are from India that are looking at kind of coming to this part of the world. You can do that in a risk-averse way by signing on to the Apex platform, releasing your APIs onto that platform, and starting to encourage and you know, start to have that conversation with FIs across the ASEAN region that are looking for certain products. And so if you're confident that your product is strong and your APIs are strong too, then you shouldn't have any problems connecting with some of these FIs, and you can kind of do that as a way to develop your business, and especially in a low touch economy that we're currently in, that you're unlikely to be traveling for the near future. So then this is a way to digitally interact and showcase what you've got.
Yeah, great. Yeah, in fact, Epix is interesting. I think it's still fairly sort of nascent in its sort of growth cycle. I think number of companies, I mean, and it will become an ecosystem play where there are many more players coming in and innovating on top of it. So I think we are in for sort of exciting, sort of days. Varun, if I can come to you, there's a question from the audience, which is around, for companies that are in the payment sector, what are the current regulation and regulatory challenges? Do they necessarily have to participate or work with a bank? And if it means by country, can you just give some very broad feedback?
The key part is depending on what you want to do. So for example, if you want to do something which is B2B in payments, then you're selling software. It should be pretty easy. Some countries have data sovereignty regulations. Primarily Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand are more sensitive to it. The good part is now Indonesia has Google Cloud. So that gives you freedom because you have at least one international cloud you can play with. So that opens up the biggest market. Usually Singapore, Philippines, and Vietnam are pretty okay with cloud. Vietnam is borderline, but there are ways to work it out. Singapore and Philippines are most cloud friendly and international data friendly. So if you are doing any of the B2B or service side of the backend side, then it's okay. The part is, if you're doing B2B on the banking side, for example, you want to do card issue. So the law is that you need to first get a scheme approval. Singapore and Philippines, you can do it without a scheme, without a BIN sponsor of a bank. Singapore and Philippines are open. But if you want to do other markets, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, you need a scheme permit. You need a bank partner. You can get an exemption. But by default, you get a bank partner. Indonesia is usually quite strict. Indonesia and Vietnam, I must have a banking partner. Thailand and Malaysia are like subject to exemptions. You can work without a bank. So that's the broad spectrum. Singapore, Philippines, you can go direct. One other option is if you want to play at the value-added services level, you may want to work with a local ASEAN company. So for example, you have customers who have, let's say, a value-added service solution, let's say a payroll automation solution. And all of that is done, and you are a payment player. What you can do is instead of solving the problem for each of the 6 markets, you can tell your customers, I will connect to 2 partners in Southeast Asia, which will open up all these 6 markets for you, and you can do it that way. So that's the premise. Depends on, are you looking at getting your customers? For payment companies, it's a lot of, are you getting your customers to expand to ASEAN, or you are coming here to hunt for new customers? If you're coming here to hunt for customers from scratch, then you will have to spend time, energy to build the downstream infrastructure and connectivity, because otherwise you'll be cost-wise, it will become prohibitive to outsource to somebody while trying to compete with his customer.
Right.
Otherwise, First Data and a lot of those companies are open to give access to everybody. So even if you want, you can come and connect to the large players like First Data to still get infra access. But partnership with bank is not that critical.
Yeah. So interesting that you touched on the B2B and sort of aspect. So if you actually extend that thought, there's a lot of companies even from West, like Revolut, just launched in Singapore. Transferace has been sort of having a hub there for a while. A lot of the companies, even from West, not just from India, at least on the B2C side, look at Singapore as a vantage point from which they can actually launch pretty much pan-Asia. So does the playbook materially change between B2B, B2C? What should founders in the B2C space be cognizant of when they look at ASEAN as a next market?
See, the premise is if you're doing B2C, one thing you have to understand is each of the ASEAN markets is different. Each of the ASEAN market is very, very different. It's a equivalent of like if you want to, let's say, look at the spectrum, what you sell in Mumbai will be very different from what you sell in a rural village in western or eastern villages side. So it's not like one B2C product which works everywhere. The key part is for B2C companies, how do you manage CAC? And usually you need to have an anchor partner or a strong anchor use case to be able to scale up B2C from scratch. So some non-fintech companies who have tried, Book My Show and those have tried, and it takes time. So if I have to look at most successful Indian companies who have scaled a B2C business properly in ASEAN, has been Cardekho. So Cardekho is, for example, right now the largest auto comparison portal in Indonesia and Philippines. But they took a 5-year horizon. They put up crew. They went small local companies to get local capabilities, to get the local understanding. So actually they bought one company in Indo, one company in Philippines, small ones, but they needed local talent, local knowledge, and then they are building, and they have a decent, now they've ranked one. So that's when I say you have achieved critical mass on those. So the key part for the B2C will be, it's culturally very, very different and sensitive. I mean, for people who have visited, the Thai culture and Indonesian culture will be opposite spectrums of it from that perspective. So which is why it's not that it's one big market and what works in Singapore will work elsewhere. It would not necessarily be true. It would probably work in the urban centers of those markets, but Jakarta is not Indonesia.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just to add to that, I think it's really, if you're having that B2C play, really thinking through who the competitors are as well, because there's a lot of strong competitors, whether backed by some of the well-known families in each of these markets, but then also backed by some of the larger kind of organizations coming out of maybe China or Japan. And so it's being clear on what that value proposition is and who are you going head to head with, because clearly you wouldn't want to go head to head with an organization that is has a lot of support and connections in that marketplace, but there are greenfield spaces, for example, opportunities for SME merchants to be digitized at the moment. I think there's a stat around 30% of SME merchants accept digital payments, and that would have grown in recent times. This stat was as of the earlier this year. So there is opportunities to kind of provide services to those guys, and that's more kind of, you know, the B2B space, but be clear, you know, just coming back on the B2C part, be clear on what is the space you want to occupy.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting points there. Pat, how, you know, so, 90 days out, how are you sort of, how do you think startups have responded to this whole crisis that has happened? It's a bit of a, abstract question, but this is a question from the audience, which is essentially asking, have fintech in ASEAN responded to the COVID crisis better? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's difficult to define what better is. I think, everyone's been hit badly. And if you think a lot of founders, probably across the world, this is the first downturn they've experienced. Most of the fintech founders weren't founders in 2008. And so this is the first time they've experienced something like this. And so I think everyone's been impacted, whether that's personally or professionally, because, having your company as a founder, everyone work from home is a massive challenge. I think there has been a good response, but, it's degrees. It really is, because we all have, founders in respective countries that are going through tough times, working out, how long runway they have, having to cut deep as well. But the advice that we've been trying to provide actually comes from, there's a guy called Tom Stafford at DST, and when we spoke to him a while ago, he talked about the advice he's giving to his portfolio company and portfolio companies at the moment, and that is to think about what the world will look like post COVID-19. Think about what business, more importantly, what business do you want to be post COVID-19? What products do you want to sell? Which customer segments do you want to serve? And then work your way backwards to where you are today and start positioning yourself for that today. And so some of that is being taken on board by a number of fintechs in Singapore. But, we have success stories and we have challenges as well. But we remain optimistic, and there's a lot of support coming through to support the community. So I wouldn't say it's better or it's worse. I just think there's a lot of press around and activity of what we're doing in the marketplace. So maybe that reaches a global audience more than some of the other great initiatives that are going on, because there are great initiatives going on in Europe as well as the US and in India as well.
Right. Yeah. One question on Apex, is around, I think it's more of a clarification. The initiatives of MAS, are largely towards the Apex platform is benefits that are there are primarily for Singapore-based companies. Is that true? And what does it take for Indian companies to avail those benefits?
So the benefits are for Singapore. There are benefits across the ASEAN region to come onto APEX. In terms of Indian companies, I think that the main benefit is to be able to reach your customers. So it's quite a cost-effective way to be able to reach customers in a seamless way. So if you have confidence in your product, I would advise you to check out the APEX platform, because they're not extortionate prices to come on for what you get from the service. To be able to access potentially 60 to 70 FIs, that's surely worth a large amount. The other aspect in terms of reaching customers, which Singapore has done very, very well, is it's grown its own festival. And I'm sure you're aware, Madhu, of the Singapore FinTech Festival.
Yeah.
That's a real anchor point in the calendar year, and it supports the community with sales, investments, and partnerships. And because we're getting the scale now of 70,000 people came to the event, or 60,000 came to the event last year. We're looking at the hybrid model of it this year, what that looks like. But there will still be a large community interacting, whether that's virtual and a part physical approach to it. But these are initiatives which will support that sales, investment, and partnership, because you need to be able to speak to customers, you need to be able to speak to potential partners and meet the VC community, and that's one thing that Singapore does very well.
Yeah, without a doubt. Varun, if I can turn to you. So there's a specific question on Cambodia and the restrictions there. I think folks have faced issue in getting the money back into India. Any comment on that? Because they are a part of FATF grey list, and doing trade is not easy, is what the person is commenting.
Yeah, so the challenge with some of those countries is, so specifically a Cambodian example. So if you have a local partner, then it's much easier, because then the local partner is there, and then local partner can remit it out. And so there are ways to manage it. Instead of probably trying to get it in India directly, you can have an offshore account, like non-Indian account. Because again, India is controlled and there's complexity. So if you have international jurisdiction accounts, so let's say if you were to use something like a transferwise borderless, for example, it will give you accounts in multiple jurisdictions already. So it will make it easier for you to get the money out from that market, even if you don't have a local partner. So I would strongly advise companies to have at least some level of international banking relationships beyond their Indian banking, because, and again, it's not expensive. I mean, even if you are getting a transferwise borderless account with 6 country bank accounts, it's like $30. Right. And it's one time which you can spend also. So it's not like fees, and there is no fixed fees. So having some of those additional footprints will help. But see, those grey lists and stuff will happen. I mean, I won't know if Myanmar gets some sanctions tomorrow. We don't know. Some of these markets will have those challenges. You want to start, because ASEAN includes countries like East Timor and Papua New Guinea. You go there, I can't even tell you how many sanctions and grey lists there would be there. So it's the cost of doing business for those markets. But the top 6 markets are clean. Yeah.
There's another question on the smartphone penetration. I think India, thanks to what Jio did, there's a huge impetus to data access, and how folks have started latching onto the screen and content. I think for TikTok, India is the largest market, and largely thanks to the data access and the inexpensive data that's available. How would you place some of the other emerging markets in Southeast Asia with respect to mobility and data access? And is this still like a feature phone market, or what are the trends that you're seeing there?
It's a very, very much similar to India. That's a very smartphone. There are feature phones, but it's at least 60-70% smartphone market, and smartphones are gone down to super low prices. And there are some innovative models. So in Indonesia, for example, smartphone is used as a collateral. Yeah. So you get a phone on loan, and next time you need loan, your phone becomes the collateral to get the loan. And if you don't pay back, they will break the phone with the software.
Break the phone?
Yeah, no, brick. So the software will disable the phone.
Okay.
The software will disable the phone if you don't pay back. So
that did sound like break.
So they're doing a lot of those solutions. So yes, for example, Myanmar will have much less smartphones. It will be much more feature phones. But if you look at the youth, the 20 to 40 age segment will be, and anything which is not super rural will be already on cheaper Chinese smartphones or Chinese manufactured phones.
Would you say, Varun, that is the case across the whole of Indonesia? Because obviously Indonesia is a collection of islands, and there must be challenges for connectivity.
Indonesia, the most of the population parts, so whether it's Java, Sumatra, are covered. But if you go to some of those super rural islands, there might be challenges. But the premise is, are you actually looking at going at a small island with 300 people? That's not your first port of call. Yeah. And the premise is expensive to put up the infrastructure there. So the premise is, if you want to cover 95% population, you can do easily. You want to go after the last 5-10%, yes, it will be complex. So let's solve 90 first.
Yeah. So there's one question on the access to the data and privacy, but I'll sort of temper it with my own sort of thoughts on this. So if you look at what happened and the great exit that Plaid had in the US, which was actually sort of disaggregated data, trying to funnel it into one common sort of API infrastructure. But India is taking a very different, a public sort of good kind of an approach where there's a regulated, licensed entity that's going to provide that access. So there's no Plaid of India that is coming up. But do you see an opportunity for a company to go out and aggregate at least at the country level some of the data access points, or is there like an account aggregator framework that's available in some of the markets that fintechs can sort of latch onto?
I would say Asian banks and Asian regulators are much more smarter to not have the equivalence of Plaids, because you're putting way too much systemic risk on one private entity. And specifically when it comes to countries' data sovereignty, data security, influence of international players on those things, I don't see any company being able to do it with the current set of regulations. And I don't think it's in the interest of these countries and their residents to have an international company come and try to build a Plaid. There are some government-driven programs. Singapore has MyInfo, Malaysia has one, Indonesia has one. They're growing, and it's okay if it takes a bit longer versus the private player, but it's a long-term solution. It's not somebody who's going to come try to build and flip it in a while. So unfortunately, I see everybody's pitches, I want to be Plaid of X and Shopify of Y. So earlier used to be Uber of X and Airbnb. Now the flavor is changed to Plaid of X and Shopify of Y. I don't think that model works.
I think timing and geography is a wonderful thing. If you think about the timing of the deal for Plaid and you think about the geography, Plaid has addressed a number of challenges that there were in the US marketplace. And I think the general view in this part of the world is these should be public goods. They should be public goods for the private sector and the public sector to flourish on top of. And I think India has the right model. Singapore has a variant of that, and you can see that there's no friction in the system. So you can really genuinely design innovative products to serve needs of businesses and consumers. If you look at fintech across Europe, a lot of fintech is seeking to address some of the deficiencies in the public goods that are there. And, there's massive industries built on top of this, whereas the general consensus and the view that across in this part of the world, as you know, Madhu, is that you have these as public goods, you provide those services, and then fintechs can start to really think about that last mile. How does that get delivered to a consumer? How does it create a better customer experience? How does it create greater efficiencies? And others can start to build on top of these solutions.
Yeah, interesting. Let me just scan through the question. One more question on the mass support. If there's a new company that is sort of coming in and wanting to set up a base in Singapore, I think Varun touched on this. If in case it's payments, you pretty much have like a ready access in terms of what you can launch with in Singapore. But truly, I mean, today there is that, it has reached a point where is there room for new payment companies to come in and operate, right? Or is it more to do with at the triangulation or at the intersection of payments and commerce, there's potentially, opportunity for new companies to come in? Because a lot of companies, a lot of founders that, even I sort of interact with, look up to Singapore as like the launch pad for their, ASEAN sort of outreach. but it typically doesn't sort of add up 1 or 2 years out, because the market is pretty much saturated from a payments sort of standpoint. I'm just specific, addressing it specific to payments. Is that maybe a shortcoming of sorts, because your journey into international geography, but you don't have, or you probably don't sort of size it well, because Singapore is fairly advanced in terms of payment tech as well. There's very little sort of, it's more a solution in search of a problem than it being the other way. So what would be your advice, Pat or Varun?
So Madhu, I'll give you examples. So people assume Singapore is saturated in everything.
Okay.
That's not the case. That is not the case. There is still significant amount of cash and check. There are still, and I'll give you real examples. So till last year, or if I were to talk to you 3 months back, you'll say Singapore, everybody card solutions are solved. I'll give you an example of a real company. They came from nowhere and they launched a product. It's a company called LightPay. This is a solution for insurance agents. Mm-hmm. The challenge for insurance agents is they sell a policy and they will get a commission for X number of months and years, as long as the policy is active. And today they want to withdraw that money earlier. And that money takes time and there is a process and everything. So what this company did was they are issuing card and account receivable automation for real estate agents, marketing influencers, and insurance agents. And they built an ecosystem on that. And then technically, when you're doing this, what credit risk? Credit risk is a Prudential or an AIA or an AXA going bust.
Right.
If they go bust, you have much bigger economy problems.
Yeah.
And what they did is they solved that problem. And now these people's whole ecosystem comes on board. And what they suddenly do is they digitize the whole chain below. Because that real estate agent has to do a lot of these things. He has to get a handyman. He has to get a painter to get all of that stuff fixed. Insurance agent has to pay a bunch of other things. Yeah. So there are opportunities. Singapore has 40,000 retail SMEs. 40,000 retail SMEs. Right now, at least 25,000 of them do not accept credit cards.
Interesting.
Do not accept credit cards, and they will have debit cards or nets. But if you look at hawkers, including the hawker centers, hawker center is equivalent to the Theliwala shops, right? More structured, organized way. They don't have digital payment solutions because they don't want a card acquiring. They want something which is delivery, ERP, doesn't need to touch hand while they are cooking the food, can accept payments, can do reconciliation from multiple wallets and payment modes. Nobody has cracked that problem. There have been multiple initiatives by the government for somebody to come and solve that problem. So, which is why there are shitload of problems in Singapore also which needs solution, which even today I don't have a solution. Even today, I don't have a solution for those problems. So it is, I would disagree that it's solved. Yes, it is solved for if you want to launch a dumb wallet where you want to issue top-up credits and cards. If that's your product, then yes, there is no value for that. But if you're going to solve a real problem, there is a truckload of problems to be solved.
Interesting.
I think most markets, I think most markets do have that, with the exception of maybe China has, quite a wealth of solutions for in the payment space. But I think Varun's right, definitely. If you're coming in with a Me Too product, you can't expect to deliver anything new. And if there is additional sources of value and you're quite clear on what that proposition is, so you're looking at that value chain, whether it's the payments value chain or the broader financial services value chain, and you're moving up and down and you're working out where is that source of value. If you think about what currently is going on in the world today and the whole concept of a low touch economy and the implications of that low touch economy, there are opportunities for providers there. We're beginning to see, organizations branch slowly out to support the needs of consumers. And the other point on this, and obviously I can't talk a great deal about it, but, if that was the case that Singapore has all of these services, then it wouldn't be looking at, the virtual banking licenses piece, which is coming down the line. So there are opportunities. It's just, you have to be quite clear on what part of the value chain you want to play in, and clearly what value there is to customers.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. The other thing, Varun, that keeps coming up is that there's a China model even in payments, right? So there's a China model that is there. India took a very different approach with what it did with UPI and how, and it has demonstrated it has grown faster than what, if you just compare it to how, Alibaba and the others grew. So what are you seeing in these markets? Is it more secular in terms of government bank or central bank backed platform play, or they are leaving it to the private enterprise to sort of build on and innovate?
So I'll give you an example from so Singapore has a new Payment Service Act and then a clause from that. So there is a clause in that if a platform is deemed to become large enough, then it will mandatorily be required to open interoperability with other players. That's put it in the law already.
Fantastic.
So the regulators do not want a China model repetition across the region, because the premise is the China model created that what happened initially in the China model was PBOC lost visibility on the P2 money supply, and they don't want that to happen. So which is why the regulators' view is that we want to encourage innovation, but we want to have full transparency, visibility, consumer protection, and ensuring that there is competition. So Singapore's, for example, statement usually is innovation with level playing field, which does not encourage value destructive competition. So, which is where the premise is the regulators are very, very concerned about repetition of 2 or 3 private companies controlling stuff and discouraging competition. And they have actively taken initiatives to ensure that it's open, and there is enough scope and availability for innovation as long as consumer interest is taken care of.
Yeah. Thank you. There's also another question around, which is what would be your advice for B2B fintechs from a sales standpoint if they have to expand to this region? If they're starting up sales, what would be your advice?
First thing, they should sign up in Apex. That will help them get visibility to 70, 75 FIs. It will also help them understand what the competition looks like, because sitting there, you won't know what's else. So think of it, you are an LOS company. I'm the best LOS in India. Okay, fine. Let's look at if there is an LOS in Singapore, for example, let's say turnkey lender. It is like production live with the second largest bank. It is production live with 10 other FIs in Southeast Asia. There is another LOS from Ping FinTech, which is live with 4 out of top 10 banks in Malaysia. So yes, you may be rock star there, but let's look at what else is there. You will not, and you need to benchmark that. So, and Pat can explain more on how you can learn what is there before you land in. And then the second part is the sales cycle. First, you need to see, okay, where's the market, which markets, what kind of FIs, and what price point does it make it worth? And then we can talk about how the actual sales process will look.
Sure. And if you think about, so if you think about the B2B marketplace in fintech, it's very difficult. That there's not a great deal of information about the B2B fintech marketplace in different markets around the world, probably, but certainly in the ASEAN region. And so Apex can give you coverage of that, but and it can help with your sales cycles. It can also help with your product development. So as Varun's saying, if you're benchmarking, you can look at how your product compares to others, what you need to do to tweak that. Because the FIs in the Apex platform release problem statements, you can get a great way of understanding where the needs are for from an FI perspective, and you can cater your product to suit those needs. But at the end of the day, you just need to do your homework before you even consider any of this. And Apex is a great way, not just for sales cycles, but to help with that homework.
Varun, you mentioned a couple of companies, but any marquee or Indian brands which probably is not visible but have made a terrific impact in the Asian region. Any success stories that you could sort of
look at a Delhi-based company called Pure Software. They actually make LOS and core banking, and they're production live with Mandiri Bank. And they have just cracked a very big deal in Africa with Standard Bank to go out in like 8 or 10 markets. They're probably going to announce a lot more new deals which are done. They are also there on Apex. They also do work with system integration partners. So in Jakarta, for example, they have their own local system integration partner with whom they have revenue sharing arrangements and everything. So that's an example of where they took a very different approach. Perfios has done an opposite approach. They have come and set up an office and they've been trying to build data aggregation and those things. There's some companies, as I mentioned, right? Those have gone directly with system integration partners. So instead of directly accessing the markets, they've gone with system integration partners and approaching from that perspective. So those are the different models of operations.
Okay. Probably the last couple of questions before we get to closing remarks. Pat, are there any concerns or cybersecurity related aspects that companies entering ASEAN should be sort of mindful of? It's probably the same wherever you operate from, but anything specific that they should be mindful of that comes to your mind?
So I think that there's a lot of support that governments are providing now. So certainly within MAS, there's a cybersecurity division, and there's a lot of information that we have on the MAS website. So you can kind of get some insights there on how to ensure that you're protected, but also there are opportunities to those cybersecurity companies that are providing solutions in this space to be able to address some of those needs. But in terms of specific, none that spring to mind. I think certainly in this part of the world where there are cybersecurity threats, they're generally not discussed. Whereas in other parts of the world, clearly in the US you hear quite a bit. In the UK and Europe, it makes the front page news. Whereas in this part of the world, you rarely hear about a lot of threats. And I'm sure Varun can kind of share a little bit on this, but obviously from a regulatory perspective, where we see our market as fairly safe.
Yeah. So I think we don't have an audience, but I would personally want to sort of put this question to you, Pat, in terms of if you just look at it as an organization, Singapore is a great sort of multicultural society, and with whatever is happening with Hong Kong, a number of global corporations are looking at Singapore to set up their hub. Like Stripe has a massive sort of setup there. I think a lot of the companies, which are even US multi-billion-dollar companies, have a base in Singapore. So there is enough talent pool that is available, as a market. But that also sort of poses a challenge in terms of how you are able to resource and have a team built out of based in Singapore, especially for early stage companies. Are there any specific sort of support that's there from us or from the government? Anything that you can talk about which could help them, in their early days?
Sure. So I think Hong Kong and Singapore are great places to locate your businesses, and Singapore has seen a growth in the past year in terms of more attention and attraction, and we're very fortunate for that. But I think in terms of talent, it's a journey really. So that there's more kind of initiatives to kind of support local talent to develop the right skill sets, and I think that we're beginning to see bear the fruits of a big education drive that's been going on for a number of years in Singapore. So those coming out of universities are coming into the world of work, and most are now beginning to see financial services as a good option. And so that there are kind of internship grants. So those organizations that take on interns that are headquarters in Singapore, there are benefits for that. There are benefits also for those that want to leverage some of the talent to build proof of concepts. So if you're a business and you're thinking of coming to this part of the world or in Singapore, there are a number of grants from a talent perspective, as long as you leverage local interns and pick up on the local resource. So that's something Singapore is very strong on, that we want to build a strong workforce, not just of expats that come into the country, but those homegrown talents, and that takes time, clearly. But there is a lot of skill sets that are beginning to develop, and I know Varun's been doing a little bit of work with the local universities here, so he can share a little bit more about that. But if one thing that's this lockdown and COVID-19 has taught us, that you don't need to be in a physical space to be able to design products and services and serve your customers. It can be from anywhere in the world. So for businesses, you may have parts of your development house in India. You may have kind of management talent in Singapore. You can make that work. Before, in the past, people would always say it's very difficult to work remotely and across geographies, but as I said earlier, necessity is the mother of invention.
Absolutely. Yeah. One last question to you from the audience, which is, do you see more and more of the push towards a cashless ecosystem, the role of biometric and biometric-based Android devices taking off, especially in markets where there's a lot of unbanked population. Because you also sort of alluded to this earlier, where India had Aadhaar, so there is a second-order benefit of Aadhaar-based payment systems and things that are sort of really taking off in India. But when the core infrastructure is not non-existent, do you see biometric as a way for financial inclusion sort of products and services?
See, biometric is useful when you have a way to reconcile that biometric with. You are collecting my fingerprint. Where will you have to make everybody has to make their own individual islands. You don't have a central way to reconcile that biometric with. If you're using biometric just as a way of authentication, then fine. I mean, use it. A PIN is also good enough. And for a lot of these places, putting a biometric sensor is much more expensive than putting a $2 keyboard or $1 keyboard where you can tap your PIN and be done with it. So I don't see biometric as a big revolution on any of these. The key part is, are you able to create low-cost products which are flexible, which work across channels, which can tap to local schemes. You have local debit schemes which are connected to bank accounts and wallets. Can you create a products at the lowest level of the near free infrastructure provided by the government? Can you build on that? Biometric is one of the several possible authentication layers. With or without biometric doesn't make or break anything. A PIN still works. A phone number still works. Push notification still works. Biometric is one of the 5-6 different ways to authenticate.
Yep. Thanks, Varun. Any closing remarks for companies that are looking to enter ASEAN?
See, the key remark from my perspective would be look at how do you want to look at internationalization of your business. And there'll probably be more series after this from Mumbai FinTech Hub around internationalization of the businesses. How to internationalize, how to manage your cap table, how to look at which kind of customers you want to go to, what kind of investors you want to go for next rounds, because that's something key. And also what COVID has taught us is create a geographically diverse base of businesses in case there are challenges in future. So that diversification and internationalization being part of baked into the growth of the company instead of an afterthought would be my feedback.
Okay, yeah. Pat, from your side?
Sure. So I think, some of the hygiene factors. So if you start with looking at the MAS website and look under its, MAS is development, and then you've got fintech and innovation, and there's a wealth of resource there to help you navigate where some of the benefits are. So I would encourage some of the founders to do that. The second is look up APIX and see, what value you can get from that platform. That there's quite a few Indian fintechs already on APIX, and so it's certainly worth looking at. I think also just looking at kind of your partners, that's one thing that's come across quite strongly in certainly the survey we did yesterday, but across, a number of conversations we've had this year, that, start to build your network out here, start to build, a market map of who are the right organizations in your particular segment within fintech, who should you be connecting with, who are some of the key stakeholders, and clearly MAS is a key stakeholder, but then you've got influencers, you've got people like Varun, you've got, SFA, so the Singapore FinTech Association. So start to build this map of who can help you, who are the potential partners, who are the types of customers you want to go after, and do your homework. I think, I know it sounds, quite rudimentary, but it's as simple as that. Do your homework, go to the right sources, get your information, build your plan, and then as soon as the opportunity arises, go for it, execute seamlessly.
Yeah. Thanks, Pat. I think we sort of coming up to the sort of wrap up of this session. We had like an hour of interesting sort of questions that came up from the audience as well. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining in and providing your inputs. For the folks on the line, I think clearly Singapore and the APIX platform gives us a great gateway into looking at how you can gain access to a lot of FIs that are based in the region. I would encourage all of you to sort of register and see what the platform can sort of help you in your go-to-market. If I can take 2 or 3 sort of key takeaways from this session, very clearly, India is sort of being the front runner in terms of how public good has been sort of you put to good use from fintech standpoint. We might be in for surprises when we go to other markets. We probably will have to tweak our models to make sure that we are able to operate the same rhythm. The other thing that we also heard about is about the fact that more and more regulators are looking to keep it open than being closed. So that this whole idea of interoperability and keeping an open framework, while also sort of keeping the data sovereignty within the country. So thereby a partnership model is what I think will be the right approach when we actually look at some of the key large markets, whether it's Indonesia or Vietnam. And also there is room for innovation. You have a few areas in ASEAN which are probably well up there in terms of urban centers, but you also have a whole bunch of pockets of markets which are rural, waiting for innovation to sort of come in. And I think for companies that are looking to ASEAN, it's a great time to sort of be there and probably grow multi-billion-dollar companies. Thanks so much everyone for joining this session. Thanks Varun, thanks Pat, and for EY to sort of organize this, and the Mumbai FinTech Hub to be the anchor for helping the fintechs in India and the startups in India get a view of what's happening in the ecosystem. Thank you everyone.
Thank you, Madhu.